Hello and welcome to Arbitrary, the flagship podcast of Law School Policy Review. Today we have with us Dr. Nikhil Menon, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. Menon is a historian of modern South Asia, specializing in the political and economic history of 20th century India. Menon grew up in Chennai and studied at University of Delhi as well as Jawaharlal Nehru University. He did his PhD in history from Princeton. As noted, his research interests include 20th century India, particularly histories of democracy, development, and diplomacy in independent India. Menon's book, Planning Democracy: How a Professor, an Institute, and an Idea Shaped India, forms the crux of our conversation today. The book reveals how India wedded Western style liberal democracy and Soviet inspired economic planning in the mid 20th century when the Cold War pitted them as incompatible. It shows how planning enabled the establishment of independent India's data infrastructure, the role of PC Mahanolobis, and more. Parallelly, the book shows how the rhetoric of democratic planning led to the government engaging citizens through means as varied as films, plays, and even Hindu ascetics, and the centrality of planning in the narrative of the Indian nation building more generally. Together with Prem, I welcome you to the show, Nikhil. Thanks for agreeing to do this.
Thank you, Parv, so much, and thank you, Prem, for inviting me, for engaging with my book. It's a real pleasure to be on.
Well, at the outset, Nikhil, what an absolutely well-written book. As someone deeply interested in the history of economic thought, I found this book both riveting and useful. So may I begin by asking you, what made you write the book?
What made me write the book? I suppose some of it was a compulsion. I was doing a PhD and I was doing research, but more seriously, the reason I was interested in the topic is that I grew up in India in the 1990s, and planning was something that was still very much around. There were 5-year plans, and the Planning Commission was written about in newspapers. It was all around us, but it seemed to have been something that had seen a fall from grace, had once been extremely popular, but was now seen as a vestige of an earlier era. And as I was beginning my PhD, I knew that I wanted to work on independent India. This was a time in which there were, I began my PhD in 2011, and there were just a few works that were beginning on the histories of the 1950s and 60s. And I felt that this was something that I hadn't studied in school. Our histories, at least till when I was an undergrad in Delhi, stopped in 1947, right, with independence and partition. And I thought that there was actually lots to be done on the history of independent India, and planning was something that, again, that I felt seemed extremely important to the time, but one that was under historicized, in that all the writing about it seemed to be from either ex-planners or by economists. But there seemed to be, I thought that there must have been some fascinating history about why planning became so popular in a country which had a liberal democracy, and that's why I began the research on this book. The topics that I ended up writing about, those were more by happenstance. Some of it, as with all historians, driven by what you find in the archives and how your interests evolve as you're in the archives. But that's how I broadly came to the subject.
Yeah, so I'll dive straight into questions now. Now we know, and as you point out in the book as well, our colonial administrators also tried to map India. The census, we all know, began under the British. Later, the interwar period also witnessed the march of planning, so to speak. Um, Central planning was very much in vogue back home in Britain, with the Labour Party coming in after the war, etc. Do you see any continuity between the colonial and post-independence narrative of statistics?
You're right to say that there are some continuities, but my research really tries to focus on the discontinuities or the ruptures between these periods. As you mentioned, from the late 19th century, statistics in India was becoming more elaborate, more detailed. But what most of these colonial era statistics did is that they dealt with trade and administration. And apart from that focus, they were also disaggregated by province, right? So Madras province, the United Provinces would have their own sort of separate statistics on trade and administration. And what the first half of my book tries to argue is that the establishment of a centralized national statistical infrastructure or a centralized data infrastructure was really a post-colonial phenomenon. And that this national statistical infrastructure involved the founding of institutions like the Central Statistical Organization, the position of a statistical advisor to the government of India, a statistical service cadre in the ICS, in the civil services, the regular measurement of national income, or what today we call GDP, and perhaps the most significant achievement institutionally was the National Sample Survey. And as your listeners will perhaps recognize, many of these institutions still are in use till today. And the argument that I make in the first half of my book is that these institutions, these statistical or data institutions, were developed in direct response to the needs of centralized planning. India had chosen to plan its economy, and the actors involved in this institution building, this data institution building, pointed to 5-year plans as the impetus behind setting up this data infrastructure. So yes, there was a continuity, but I think that there is more insight to be gleaned from looking at the ruptures rather than the continuities.
Right. Thank you for that. I'd like to proceed to the next question that we had lined up. So regarding the origins of why we felt that we needed planning at the time, you mentioned a couple of central reasons, some of them being that it was a nationalist counter-reaction to colonialism, it was India's middle path in the Cold War. My question would be, would you say that planning is in some sense an imported idea? And the reason this question comes up is because we saw how a lot of Mahanolobis' inputs were from foreign scholars at the time. At the time, planning was not something that was peculiar to India as such, particularly in the light of Soviet influence. There was also a push for import substitution, which was incorporated in planning, which, as you noted, was Western orthodoxy at the time. Would you then say that perhaps planning was a sort of imported idea?
Thanks, Prem, for that question. I think that when thinking about whether something is imported or indigenous, I think it's worth pausing to consider what we mean by those terms, imported or domestic or indigenous ideas, because I think historians find it notoriously difficult to definitively identify the origin of an idea. Right? I mean, ideas don't come with birth certificates, so we don't know where. It's very, very hard to pin down an idea to one geographic location. And so while I'd agree with the description of centralized planning as drawing from foreign inspiration, in the early 20th century from Japan, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, Indian planners like Mahanolobis thought that there were actually antecedents in Indian history as well, right? Mahanolobis would point to things like statistical developments in the Arthashastra, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, or in the administrative systems of the Mughals, and say that those actually are also examples of when there are booms in state building, that there is also an architecture of statistics and data that is developed. And so I think that for the purposes of Indian history, it's more useful to think about how Indian planning acquires its unique character, which is a combination of foreign influence and homegrown contributions. But you are certainly right to point towards its very global character. During the mid-20th century, there is certainly this wave of global planning, a global wave of planning, and that though I say planning, it doesn't mean that the rest of the world was following exactly the same economic policies as India, because planning was this umbrella term that included very different strategies on levels of control, on centralization, on trade and industrial policy, etc. But I think that the influence of the Great Depression should not be underestimated. The Great Depression really showed to global markets the vulnerability of the capitalist system. And close on the heels of that, the Second World War proved to many and demonstrated the effectiveness of state involvement in the economy. And so I think that both the Great Depression in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and the Second World War in the 1940s were both important backdrops to the popularity of planning globally at this time.
Right. It makes sense to me that you mentioned that what's most significant is perhaps pay attention to the unique character of the way that planning developed in India. So my follow-up to that would be, would you say, or in what manner do you think the failure of planning as such has affected how we see our modern economic order today, in the same way that the Great Depression affected how we brought planning into existence?
Yeah, I think that again, there is a I think there's sometimes a sort of nostalgia for planning as well. I mean, in my book, in the final pages of my book, I talk about how at the during the in the 2019 campaign for the general elections, Rahul Gandhi talked about scrapping the Niti Aayog and reviving the Planning Commission. Mamata Banerjee, when campaigning in West Bengal, talked about having a planning commission for her state, which would include these famous economists like Abhijit Banerjee, Amartya Sen, sort of homegrown talent on its own planning commission. And there is, and I also talk about how there have been editorials in financial newspapers in India asking who will be the BJP's Mahanolobis, about rebuilding the house that Mahanolobis had built. So I think that there is a yearning for a kind of technocratic savior. I think that the popularity of Raghuram Rajan, the sort of celebrity status he enjoyed just a few years ago, it sort of is part of this. And so I think that is at I think that 10 years ago, the stock of planning was even lower than it is today. I think that today, that in some ways, there's almost, in certain circles, a nostalgia for a body that was comprised of experts and that was put on a pedestal by the government. And I think in a political climate today, when I think many people feel that the government looks down on intellectuals and on expertise, I think that there is a nostalgia for the Planning Commission. Whether that is an appropriate response or a sort of misguided response to the situation is, I think, up to your listeners to discern. But I do think that while India has turned away from planning, I think that it is hard to say where that leads India. I mean, it certainly has not led India to become a laissez-faire economy or even a capitalist economy, even to the extent that, say, the United States is. Interestingly enough, in the United States, there's been a debate over the last 2-3 years, especially after the COVID pandemic, about industrial policy and the return of industrial policy in the United States, a turn away from globalization and from free trade towards, especially in the battle against China, towards providing subsidies for domestic industrial production. And so in some ways, you see America, the sort of arch capitalist nation on the planet, itself turning back towards policies that would remind people of import substitution of the 1950s in India. So I think that there is today, I think that those questions are once again being opened up again. So I think that the certitude that we might have had in the 1990s or the early 2000s about the path that India might take or the path that India should take, I think even amongst very mainstream economists, there has been a turn in those ideas.
Thanks for that, Nikhil. Just to sort of steer back to the book, while planning was the orthodoxy of the day, there was some resistance to it too. Um, we had the Swatantra Party, Rajagopalachari, Meenu Masani, the entire political cohort on one side. You had B.R. Shenoy, C.N. Vakil, and P.R. Brahmananda, the economists, on the other side. Um, how powerful, in your assessment, was this resistance to statistical planning? Um, and how was this resistance or opposition channelized systematically, if at all? Um, do you think it was scattered, which perhaps also explains why it failed? And what support, if any, did the free marketeers outside India extend to this opposition?
Thanks. That's a great question. And I think that what we need to remember, and what I think that what I try to do in the book is to remind us that these figures of opposition, all of whom you rightly mentioned, represented collectively a marginal position in the Indian political discourse. That is what I'm trying to, in some ways, recover through the early pages of my book, that all of these figures who today you might think of as representing mainstream economic opinion, in the 1950s, they were marginal opinion. It wasn't as if Nehru was choosing an idiosyncratic path in choosing planning. Actually, the majority of economists backed this strategy. And so what I was actually very surprised at is how popular the idea of planning was in the 1940s and the 1950s. And as I said, part of that surprise comes from having grown up, as you did, much younger than me as you are, and having grown up in a post-liberalization India, where the market has already ascended to this hegemonic place. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is recover the intellectual context of the mid-20th century. And in that context, you find that amongst politicians, planning was backed by the people seen as the economic modernizers in the Congress party, like Nehru and like the Subhash Chandra Bose. Bose, in fact, is the one that proposes a national planning committee. Amongst sort of modernizer scientists, Meghnad Saha and Mokshagundo Bisvesvaraya are arguing for planning from the late 1920s onwards. Amongst industrialists, again, a group that you might imagine would be just to whom planning would be anathema, J.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, Lala Sriram, they're all for planning. In fact, they come up with their own plan, as many might recognize the Bombay plan of 1940. In the 1940s, planning of different kinds is proposed by the Congress, by communists, by businessmen in the Bombay plan, by Gandhians, even by the Muslim League. I was also amazed at how popular planning was internationally at the time. As you mentioned, Britain's Labour Manifesto in the mid-1940s mentions planning, the Soviet Union is planning, China is planning, South Korea is planning, Japan is, Vietnam, Malaysia, France, Mexico, Argentina, Ghana, Sudan, Tanzania, and Africa. This is just one of dozens of, these are just some of dozens of countries that are planning in different ways. And the reason for this, of course, is that mainstream development economics at the time recommended policies of state-led industrialization, of import substitution, and of planning for late industrializing countries that were in what was called the third world, or countries of the global south that were sort of just now decolonizing. So once again, India and Nehru at the time were making fairly orthodox choices. Now, you can say that those were bad choices to make, but if you were arguing that, you were arguing against the preponderance of what economists in that country were arguing, and internationally were arguing was appropriate for India at the time. And so I think the what we need to remember is that mainstream opinion within a field like economics changes over time, and that has its own effects, right? So you can't, so even for those who believe that expertise is important, just simply saying follow the expertise is not always a panacea. And the dissenters in the 1950s there were some, as you mentioned, but they were few and far between. And one set of critics were the Gandhians, who believed that the Planning Commission's emphasis on industrial growth and urbanization was abandoning Gandhi's belief in a village-based, decentralized, sort of agrarian economics. Someone like J.B. Kripalani, who was the former president of the Congress, falls into that category. Another set of critics were people like, Rajaji C. Rajagopalachari and Minu Masani, who would form the Swatantra Party in 1959. And these were economic conservatives who believed in a modern industrial economy, unlike, say, Gandhi, but wanted the state to play a much smaller role in it. And so the Swatantra Party would be this kind of liberal, pro-market political outfit. And amongst economists, there were critics, but they were marginal. They were marginalized even in the academy. And these were the people who were referred to as the Bombay School, right? B.R. Shenoy, C.N. Vakil, P.R. Brahmananda, people of the Bombay School of the wage goods model. But they talk about the hostility that they had to face, and sometimes they talk about how being critical of the plan was sometimes was to be seen as anti-nationalist, and sometimes even a CIA agent. But while their critique was important, again, I want to stress that their criticism was one that would gain acceptability only from more widespread acceptability only from the late 1960s, after the crises of the initial plans. And it's important to remember why the Mahanolobis model won out, and it's because it was popular amongst professional economists in India at the time. So many of the biggest names in economics from that time, V.K.R.V. Rao, K.N. Raj, Sukhmay Chakravarti, Amartya Sen, even Jagdish Bhagwati, were all very pro planning in the 1950s. And so, for example, what I try to do in the book is to not just present the views of planners, but also present the views on planning by people who are critics of planning and their assessments of why planning succeeded, but not succeeded in terms of it being effective, but succeeded in that it was implemented as opposed to a non-planned economy being pursued. So the British economist Peter Bauer was a lifelong opponent of protectionism and state planning. And he talks about how, and I'm going to quote, he talks about how the Mahanolobis' plan frame and the second five-year plan very largely reflected the then dominant opinion of development economics in the West, that it was then current orthodoxy. And that then he goes on to talk about how it was not just orthodoxy amongst these development economists, but it also received endorsement from prestigious and influential publications in the West and by international aid agencies like the Ford Foundation and USAID. And somebody who today is seen as very much a champion of the market and of laissez-faire economics, Jagdish Bhagwati, today he's a famous critic of planning, but even he recalls coming under the influence of Mahanolobis in the 1950s. And he said, and I quote again, back then we were all export pessimists. And sort of he's joked afterwards saying that, India's misfortune was to have brilliant economists. And so I think that that's the context in which we need to think about the criticisms of the five-year plan and why the criticisms didn't land a bigger blow on them.
That's actually very useful. And as we are on the subject of critique of planning, we discussed political and economic critiques. Let's turn to sociological critique of central planning. Now, you note that the adoption of centralized economic planning elevated the discipline of statistics to a status rivaling economics. Now, quite obviously, planning is made possible by accumulating masses of statistics about people. And anthropologists and sociologists like Michel Foucault and James C. Scott have critically examined the centrality of statistics in the project of state control. And these accounts are, broadly speaking, critical of the political rationality embedded in statistics. In similar spirit, though slightly differently, Austrian liberals who favor laissez-faire economy model say that statistics foster in the interventionist a sense of knowledge and expertise, and this sense of expertise and precision is also challenged in the Austrian tradition. Now, do you think that in India, the project of planning led to a depoliticization of sorts, where citizens and their lived realities became numbers for the state? Or put differently, the citizens were abstracted into population groups that were to be managed instead of, say, governed. And were the policymakers of that time cognizant of this pitfall of over-reliance on statistics to solve the problems of the community, the society, the economy?
Yeah, Parv, I think that you put your finger on one of the key themes of the book. In the first half of the book, one of the arguments I try to make is that planning and the development of this data infrastructure sparks, planning and the data infrastructure that it sparks leads to a technocratic mode of policymaking. And technocracy, of course, is a depoliticized domain by its very nature. The Planning Commission itself was created as a body that was meant to be insulated from and unresponsive to political pressure. And you find that someone like Mahanolobis, to him, economic questions had either right or wrong answers. To him, he was, of course, trained as a physicist, and he thought of economics in some ways like physics, that there were plainly right and incorrect answers. And in the book, I talk about how a then young Milton Friedman, who would, in the latter half of the 20th century, become a celebrity economist and champion of the free market. In the 1950s, Milton Friedman meets Mahanolobis and is very impressed with Mahanolobis's intellect, but completely disagrees with Mahanolobis's solutions to economic problems. And he has, I think, a quite insightful take on Mahanolobis, which is that he says that Mahanolobis, brilliant as he was, is like other young, gifted mathematicians in that they believe human beings are pieces on a chessboard. And he is here. Milton Friedman is channeling Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations, in which he says that some people believe that planners think of human beings as pieces on a chessboard and who can be moved according to the will of the planner. And that this is the sort of thing, Milton Friedman argues, that is very likely with someone who develops talents in mathematics at a very young age, and they become very used to having a very clear solution to a problem. But unlike in mathematics and unlike in physics, in economics, there is a lot of gray, that there isn't always a clear right or wrong answer. And that to Milton Friedman, this is the problem that planners have, which is that planners expect that these problems can be solved and that they can have all the information that's necessary to move pieces on a chessboard. But of course, human beings and economies are much more complex than chessboards, and that you cannot predict all of the variables involved in them. And so I think that for someone like Mahanolobis, at least, that criticism, the criticism of depoliticization, is justified. But on the other hand, other members of the government who were ardent supporters of planning, like Nehru, were susceptible to political pressures, and they couldn't afford to think of the matter of planning in this coldly technical manner. But Nehru too, and I think that this sort of strengthens your argument, Nehru too would often speak of development as a domain beyond or outside of politics. And so the first half of my book is really about how planning becomes this technocratic domain and planning operates as a technocracy. And of course, the second half of my book about democratic planning, which we will come to hopefully in a few minutes, tries to see the ways in which the Indian government tried to work against that technocracy at the same time. But before we sort of move on to another question, I would like to caution against the tendency to think about this trait of depoliticization as unique to centralized planning or to socialism, because we have seen similar depoliticization in the discussion in India of issues like the UID and Aadhaar, with the belief that technology offers an obvious and apparent solution, one that will not have costs or trade-offs, regardless of other concerns such as those of privacy. That the technology itself offers all the solutions. I think that we see this depoliticization in the celebration, sometimes unquestioning celebration of the market, where it is assumed that the market can resolve everything efficiently, and that there will not be costs that are effectively political choices about wealth concentration, inequality, access. These are all political questions, which I think that politicians or policymakers have to engage in, and that the market, while the market can provide answers, those answers are political answers, which have political ramifications for things such as inequality. And I think that sometimes that can be overlooked as well.
Right. So taking cue from your answer, let's now sort of pivot into and turn our attention to the second half of the book. Now, Nikhil, in theory and in practice, central planning is seen as being inconsistent with democratic freedoms. The Indian government, however, as you note, sought to negotiate a marriage between the two, and democratic planning emerged as a product of that marriage. The government called upon citizens to help build the new state through mass participation. This was affected by, of course, a colossal and mammoth program of outreach, of making people plan conscious, and success of the plans also heavily depended on the citizens actively working towards the plan. My question is, how democratic could this planning be said to be when the government is instructing its citizens to save, consume, and invest in accordance with the plan? Planning brings with it a great deal of control and coordination and interference with individual freedoms. Do you then think that democratic planning was just a mode of state legitimation that deployed the rhetoric of democracy?
If you don't mind, I'd like to begin by pushing back just a little bit on the premise, which is that planning is seen as being inconsistent with democratic freedom. Because most people in India, across the political spectrum in the 1950s in India, would have, I think, disagreed with that claim or found that claim to be strange. And I think that we need to be, sensitive of how historically conditioned our own attitudes on these matters are. And so, for example, in the 1950s in India, there didn't appear to be a reason to assume that planning and freedom were mutually exclusive. In fact, the fear in India, I think, was more about a rampant, unchecked capitalism, that this rampant, unchecked capitalism, which was associated with British colonialism, which of course India had just very recently been under the yoke of, that was an extreme form of unfreedom. That capitalism, which could lead to colonialism, that was the threat of unfreedom, and not planning. So planning was sort of seen by many as, in a way, a fight against unfreedom. And of course, then we can sort of debate, whether it becomes a form of unfreedom in itself. But to just set your listeners who perhaps may not be familiar with my book, just so they get a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about this rhetoric of democratic planning that the Indian government had, I'd just like to give your sort of listeners some sense of what this was. So democratic planning was this idea that the Indian government had, and it was a phrase that they repeated, ad nauseum through the 1950s and 60s. It was the idea that Indian planning was different from communist planning, that Indian planning was different from what was happening in China and the Soviet Union, basically because in India, what there was only carrot, only incentive, but no stick, like no coercion was possible, like in China or the Soviet Union, where you could not just, expropriate property. You could not just sort of compel people through the threat of jailing, for example, to do certain things. And so you're right to say that, there are sort of some limits on people's freedoms, but it's through incentives and disincentives. And I think at that point, one might argue about, how different is that from, say, a central bank raising interest rates, thereby, influencing consumer patterns in society, right? So, or a government raising taxation rates, thereby impinging on a consumer's ability to spend or to save, etc. And so I think that is what people are the Indian government is talking about when they say democratic planning, which is that there will be plans, but I think that we need to remember what Indian planning was effectively was not like what planning in Soviet Union or China was or could be. So what Indian democratic planning was this kind of mixture of real idealism, some might say naivete, about democracy and popular participation and citizenship, combined with, I think, also a realism about state capacity, about how limited Indian state capacity was, and that it is because Indian state capacity is so limited that you needed to engage in this sort of all-out public outreach program in order to get citizens excited and enthused about the five-year plans and therefore save and invest and contribute towards it, even if you're not getting any money or remuneration for it, right? So just voluntary contributions, which I spent a chapter in the book talking about these voluntary contributions towards the plan. And so it is, democratic planning is a concept that really smacks of Nehruvian India. It's a concept that I think might appear faintly ridiculous today, but at the time, we have to remember the 1950s. This is a generation of Indians that had spent decades, if you're an adult, under British colonialism and had been a part of a freedom struggle. And so perhaps the idea of calling upon people to make voluntary contributions was not as absurd then as it might sound today. And so democratic planning was socialist inspired, of course, but not quite socialist. It was romantic in its vision, but often fell short in its practice. And so the Indian state really put a lot of time, money, and effort behind popularizing these plans. And it took a remarkable number of forms. And if you don't mind, I'd just like to give listeners a sense of the kinds of forms that this democratic planning took and this campaign took. So the Ministry of Information Broadcasting had an entire wing dedicated to planned publicity, and there were publicity officers in districts across India traveling on bullock carts, on jeeps, on boats, carrying publicity materials about the five-year plans, showing films on film projectors with a bed sheet that they would put perhaps between two trees or like two poles on which they'd project a film, sort of planned propaganda. There was a song and drama division in which dramatic troupes across the country were hired and paid to perform skits and plays and musicals about the Panchvarshya Yojana or the plan. There were university planning forums across the country. Most central universities in the country and colleges had a university planning forum where undergraduate students, debated aspects of the 5-year plan. There was a magazine called Yojana, which still exists today, which was about the 5-year plan. There was a voluntary organization called the Bharat Sevak Samaj. There was, of course, the films division that was producing a huge amount of films about development and 5-year plans. And some of these films are really absolutely fascinating. I talk about one in which a villager visits the planning commission in Delhi, another about an alien visiting from a distant planet, checking in on the progress of the 5-year plans. And I also talk about how this was just the government's own effort at popularizing the plans. But I think that we have to also consider the ways in which democratic planning became part of the popular culture of the era, how plans seeped into the popular culture of the era. And as I discuss in the book, there were novels in the 1950s, like the highly regarded Jhuta Sach by Yashpal, which talks about planning. There were popular plays like Hamara Gaon that had planning as its key backdrop. Bollywood movies like Naya Daur, which featured Dilip Kumar, Char Dil Char Rahein with Raj Kapoor, Shami Kapoor, and Meena Kumari. Bollywood songs sung by Lata Mangeshkar and Mohammad Rafi that talk about planning. And of course, there is the experiment that I end the book with called the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, a quite surprising experiment between the Congress party and its politicians and sadhus or Hindu ascetics, in which figures in the Congress party like Gulzar Lal Nanda especially thought that the way to really reach the Indian population and to convince them about the applicability and desirability of planning and citizen involvement in them was by reaching out to them through a religious medium, through sadhus, and having sadhus sort of preach the gospel of the 5-year plan and sort of incorporate the 5-year plan into their kathas of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And so these are the sort of many ways in which the democratic planning unfolded. And I mean, to just briefly come back to your question of how democratic it was, this is the sort of central tension that I identify in the book, the push and pull between these competing urges of technocracy and democracy. And that's what makes it fascinating to me as a historian, because there were enough people, both in the Indian government and in India at the time, who seemingly, paradoxically, were committed to both technocracy and democracy at the same time. And they seem to have held both these ideas that were obviously in tension in their heads and in their policies at the same time. And that's what I'm trying to uncover through this book.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense and is very useful. And as we speak of the incompatibility between planning and freedom, perhaps it might be useful to also distinguish between the economic coercion of the 1970s under Indira Gandhi and the Nehruvian central planning in the 1950s, which, as Jagdish Bhagwati and Arvind Panagaria note somewhere, was not marked by heavy nationalization or decimation of private property rights, etc., of the sorts witnessed under Mrs. Gandhi. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that again, if you go to critics of planning, even people like, say, as you said, Arvind Panagria or Jagdish Bhagwati or Vivek Debroy or Niranjan Rajadhaksha, they all make this sort of distinction between, even though they don't really approve of all Nehruvian policies, they still say that there is a qualitative difference between the policies that were pursued in the 1950s and 60s and in the late 1960s and 1970s. And that under Indira Gandhi especially, you see, again, without getting into whether it's good or bad, a much greater level of state control and intervention in the economy, and an environment that is much less sort of hospitable to say, private industry.
Right. Thank you for that. If I can just circle back to looking at planning globally, the way that we had previously discussed it, the way that the Planning Commission was sort of legitimized and promoted was by using democratic rhetoric as justification. So it would seem to me that this was neither new nor peculiar to India. Would you say that this use of democratic rhetoric and democratic planning of the Indian kind have any parallels elsewhere? If so, could they inform our understanding of the trajectory that planning eventually took?
There were, as you say, of course, other countries that retained democracy and had planned economies. But I think India was, even amongst that cohort of countries, India was particularly prominent and particularly noteworthy. And the reason is that India was the one of the countries, say, like, for example, France also had a democracy and a planned economy. But India was the one that globally was seen as the test case, as the one that had the greatest stakes. Why? Because of India's size. At the time, a population of around 300 million people, already at the time, the sort of second most populous country in the world. The depth of its poverty was another factor. The geographic location in Asia, right in the backyard of the two largest communist countries in the world, the Soviet Union and Mao's China. All of these combined to make India seem to, for example, if you read the sort of the headlines from, say, the New York Times from the late 1940s, early 1950s, when they talk about planning in India, they refer to India as a sort of last bastion, as a global experiment to see, because if India was not able to maintain this, they believed that India would be another domino that would fall to communism. And so I think India was seen as having the greatest stakes in amongst these cohort of countries. And the manner in which each of these countries went about the economic organization was, of course, unique to each. And so as an Indian and as a historian of India, to me, it is India's path that I find the most interesting. But apart from those very sort of narrow reasons of being, from India and being a historian of India, I do think that even globally, there is on an objective level, I think the Indian case was the case of democratic planning with the greatest stakes. And I think that that apart, some of the ways in which democratic planning played out in India, such as, say, the use of sadhus that I alluded to a few minutes ago, those were absolutely unique to India.
Right. Nikhil, you note in the book that the Congress government often defended the plans by pointing to the electoral mandate it continually secured. But using that, as Meenu Masani said, was to miscalculate the real feelings of the people. Planning may not have been such a popular undertaking after all. In any case, how much of democratic planning was a means by which the Congress's position as the party in power was legitimized? You mentioned that despite uneven results, the government remained committed to plan uh, publicity campaigns. Is that perhaps explained, at least in part, by the Congress's desire to keep these campaigns alive and going for political or electoral purposes?
I think that it's a question that uh, is important and is one that I try to address to some extent in my book, but it's one that I found hard to answer because it is. I think that in some ways the most obvious answer is that the Congress Party continues with this planned publicity campaign well into the 1960s and 1970s, early 1970s, because it must have had some electoral purchase. There must have had some, positive ramifications electorally. But I don't see any real evidence of that. I mean, it's not the most efficient way of spending money. If you were to, I mean, of course, you could say that, it's not the Congress Party spending money, it's the government of India spending money. And so this is a sort of proxy for Congress propaganda. I think that, I think that it still doesn't seem to be a efficient allocation of election campaign resources, of the Congress Party's time. I think that some of it is explained by institutional inertia, that things that are set up in the 1950s, it's just continued. Some of it has to do with the identity of the state, which is the identity of the post-colonial state comes to be associated with development, and the state and the government wants to associate itself with today, as the government talks about vikas, right? About being the engine that is delivering development to India. Some of it has to do with the genuine idealism about planning being something that, and this idea of democratic planning, which is that citizens should be aware of the plans and they should participate in it. But among the more cynical parts of government, perhaps they just thought of it as, well, we still are planning our economy. And by the 1960s and 70s, certainly planning is still seen as central to how the Indian economy is organized. Well, and then so if we're going to plan the economy, and yet the Indian state's capacity is so little, we certainly need people to be investing in accordance to what we want. We still want them to be saving in accordance to what we want. We still then want them to, consume in accordance to what we want, right? So, and this is something that other scholars like Taylor Sherman, Benjamin Siegel have talked about in their work as well, which is that there is this whole emphasis on self-help, this emphasis that Indians, for example, during a famine, that they, in early post-independence India, that they skip a meal in order that there not be a famine in other parts of the country, that they not spend on certain items in order that foreign exchange be preserved, that they save in accordance with what the five-year plan recommends, that they bank with certain banks in accordance with what the five-year plan recommends, that they buy gold in accordance, or they sell gold in accordance with what the government wants. All of this is because the government realizes that without citizens doing these things voluntarily, with some nudging by the government's five-year plans had no hope at all to succeed. And that, I think, is partly why there is this continuing effort at propaganda about the plans, about spreading the message about the plans, because it's seen as being essential to making the economy tick. But I think apart from that, you are right that I think that some of it has to do with it, fusing with government or citizen money being paid for Congress campaigns. Some of it has to do with also the fact that planning had become this, as I argue in the book, this kind of grand narrative for the nation after independence. It was one of these master narratives that held the country together. The idea that all of the aspects of what we want this country to be is held together by the plan. And if the plan was a good way to convey all of the messages the government wants to convey. And so I think those are, I don't think there's one reason that I could identify, but I think that a combination of just institutional lethargy, inefficiency, cynical Congress propaganda, and some idealism / naivete / realism were some of the ingredients that went into these planned publicity campaigns continuing.
I just want to circle back to something that's contemporarily relevant. Now, coming back to the Planning Commission's ultimate failure and the different economic model that we see playing out today, do you think that a lack of strong computational abilities was one of the significant reasons why planning didn't seem to work out as well back then? Because we saw in many parts of the book how procuring computers was always a challenge, and how they contribute to planning was always a conundrum, was always a dilemma. As such, to what extent would you say that the lack of computational abilities has ultimately led to, I wouldn't say the triumph of a laissez-faire model of economic organization, but definitely a more significantly market-oriented model of economic organization? Given that now we have extremely advanced computational technology, do you see planning making a comeback in some sense, or are things different this time around?
I think that the question has been raised, in economic circles about whether the triumph of big data heralds a new era for economic planning. I refer in the book to pieces in the last 4 or 5 years from the Financial Times, from the Wall Street Journal, which ask the question, which is that now that we have supercomputers and we have big data, since information and the ability to crunch information was one of the signal flaws of the planning system, now that is much more easily available, could planning make a comeback? And in some ways, China continues to plan its economy, right? China is considered one of the most successful economies in the world, and a threat certainly to US supremacy. And certainly China is, has been beaten India for decades now in its, and is far, far ahead of India. And it continues to plan its economy. So again, I think that when it comes to planning, I think we need to separate what we mean within the umbrella of planning? Are we talking about import substitution policies, which is certainly not what China follows now, especially after Deng Xiaoping? Or is it export-led strategies that are still planned? Are we talking about some level of government control and some level of private industry? Or are we talking about an economy that's completely controlled by the government? And I think that the continued resilience and success of the Chinese economy does throw open the question of, well, could planning still work today? I mean, the question of whether we should adopt it or not is a different question. But the question of whether it could survive in the modern day environment, I think is pretty clear. The Chinese example shows up one way in which it can be remarkably resilient. So I don't think that really it's India's insufficient computational abilities in the 1980s that led to the downfall of planning and the rise of a more market-oriented economy. I think that had more to do with the inability of the Indian economy, the Indian planned economy, to match growth expectations, even compared with other planned economies, such as that of China or South Korea from the 1980s onwards, right? So India's planning was seen as a failure because it was not matching that of many other economies in the world. And also combined with that, the fact that by the 1980s, economic orthodoxy and the mainstream view of development economists had changed on these questions, on the questions of whether the state should be as centrally involved, on questions of import substitution. So again, Indian economic policy is perhaps a sort of lagging indicator of where mainstream professional economists' views on these matters are. And not to mention that one of the reasons that I think that planning loses its cachet is the epical event of that decade of the 1980s, which is the downfall of the Soviet system, which of course discredits the plan model to an enormous degree. The Soviet system was the system that was most associated with planning, and the fact that the Soviet Union crashes in on itself leads to planning itself losing some of its sheen.
Yeah. Nikhil, you note that the Planning Commission's prestige began losing altitude during the second five-year plan. Parts of the plan had to be scrapped, etc. When Nehru died, the Planning Commission lost its most powerful champion, as you note. Now, fast forward to 2014, the Planning Commission was consigned to history. But even though the Planning Commission, the institute tasked with planning, met its demise, planning as the dominant governance philosophy perhaps continues to remain central to Indian policy making to this day. And when I say planning, I mean planning as understood very generally. What do you think?
I think that when we're talking about continuities, I think it's best to be very careful about what we think is continuing, right? Because even though the Planning Commission existed from 1950 to 2014, they were very different organizations at those two ends of that chronology from 1950 to 2014. And so in some ways, the Planning Commission, the final years of UPA2, of say 2010 to 14, was closer to today's Niti Aayog than the Planning Commission of say 1956, right? I mean, just to sort of clarify, the Planning Commission in 2010 is perhaps closer to Niti Aayog today than the Planning Commission of 2010 is to the Planning Commission of 1950s. And whether planning still continues, I guess, again, depends on what we mean by planning. If we mean by that planning the government's veneration of expertise, of placing technocrats on a pedestal, appropriately or not, placing them on a pedestal even above politicians, then we certainly do not see any similarity there or any continuity there between Nehruvian planning and today. If it is, because as we know, today intellectuals don't quite have the same influence, or even economists don't quite have the same influence in or over government. Something like demonetization, which has very, 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 very few professional economists backing it, is the sort of the exhibit A for that claim. But we also know that today the finance ministry and the prime minister's office wields much more power than a body like the plan. That's the replacement for the planning commission, right? That the Niti Aayog wields much less influence on economic matters than the finance ministry or the prime minister's office. Again, that is a discontinuity from the 1950s, where the planning commission was seen as being problematic precisely because of how much power it had in comparison to, say, the finance ministry and other more political branches of the government. But again, if by planning you mean central control from New Delhi and inadequate federalism and inadequate state powers, then that, of course, persists, even if in a very altered form.
Right. It's actually the last version of it that I meant. As in, when I meant planning as understood generally. Like, unlike market economies, which have informational compactness, information about preferences is revealed in demand, supply, prices in the market. Planners, on the other hand, because they lack that critical information, rely on carefully calculated, granular, in fact, astonishingly granular knowledge about production utility functions, which again is obtained through collecting masses of statistics. An exercise that I think continues to this day, um, as far as Indian government is concerned. Um, yeah.
Right, but also in very problematic ways, right? Because as I'm sure you're aware of the many debates happening right now about what statistics the government of India chooses to acknowledge and chooses not to acknowledge, the meddling with some of India's national statistics, including National Sample Survey, consumer not releasing consumer expenditure data, delaying the census. So I think there's a big debate also about, even if India's economy is more market oriented, that India still needs these statistics to show whether India's economy is progressing or how well it's doing or how poorly it's doing. And I think, as I say in my book, the government has realized that good data is not always good politics. And so we see that there's been a pushback amongst many statisticians and economists across the board. From the economic right to the economic left, saying that we need much more independence with statistics, but that's a whole debate about where Indian statistics is going today.
Right. I realize we have taken a lot of your time, so the final question, on a slightly personal note, how do you organize your research? How do you retain what you consume? I'm sure one continuously consumes a lot of knowledge on a daily basis to be able to come up with a book as thorough and rigorous as this. And how do you break monotony, if at all there is any? Are you reading or watching anything these days?
Thank you. The process by which I organize and retain information, I am not the most organized, and so I'm always jealous of other scholars who are more organized. But I think that the way I go about it is to spend as much time as I can with the primary materials, to not go in with a sort of overdetermined picture of what I want to argue, but have some sense of the themes I want to approach, but allow for the evidence to guide me. I think, trying to make sure that you are scrupulous, and I think this is a professional necessity as a historian, to be scrupulous about maintaining records of where you got information from, of keeping records of citation information, etc. I think that the more time you spend with it, I think that people will come up organically with their own ways of organizing it. For me, I probably came up with methods that had a lot of inefficiencies in them, quite honestly. But I think that the longer you spend with it, I think that you become comfortable with the material, and more comfortable. You never become fully comfortable, but you find your way to navigate the maze of documents. But of course, along with that, you have to keep up with the work that other scholars are doing, and so I try to keep up as much as I can with the scholarship of others, and to try to keep such a summaries of books and articles that I'm reading, so that I have some sense of what, so that I have a sort of shorthand for what others have argued. But yeah, I should be honest and say that I'm no paragon of administrative efficiency. I am quite the opposite, and so this book is whatever it is despite all of my lack of policy and efficiency, not because of it. And what do I break the monotony with? I'm a fiend for popular culture. I consume, movies, television shows. I'm happy this summer to be back to reading some novels that I've really enjoyed. So I mean, all the usual culprits that consume time but are happy distractions. But if you were asking me what I'm consuming right now, I'm reading a novel right now by this novelist called Rebecca Mackay, which is about, I think, which is a novel. I'm suddenly forgetting the name of the novel. It has a long name. But it's about a podcaster returning to her boarding school to solve a murder that seemed to have been solved decades ago. I just finished watching The Hard, which I thought was excellent, and I am beginning a Netflix show called Kohra, which is, I think, a Punjabi show, which seems to be interesting so far.
Nikhil, thanks for agreeing to record this. It was delightful to finally sit down and discuss this with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Parv. Thank you so much, Prem. I really appreciate you taking the time to read my book and to spend this time engaging with it.